Hi everyone, my name is Dakota, and this is the first video in a channel that I'd like to call Limelight Astrology. And my goal with Limelight Astrology is to observe the events of particularly celebrities and famous figures such as politicians and whatnot, and to notice the similarity or draw a parallel to the horoscope or the natal chart of that moment, of that that thing happening to them. And for this first video, I decided to take Chester Bennington's natal chart, the one he was born with, and the horoscope or the chart for the time that he probably had hung himself, just about that time. So here's the birth chart right here, and the death chart would be this one here. So I don't want to bore you guys, and I want to get right down to it because there's a lot to talk about, but I'm going to give you the spark notes and speed right along. The first house is the house of the self. It housed his emotions and his dreams and healings. That's the moon and Neptune. And this first house is kind of like the book by the cover. It's the first impression you get of anybody or any situation. It's what's most noticeable. Now, in his fourth house, which is the house of the home, Chester had 3 planets, or 3 indicators here. He had Venus, Mercury, and the Sun. Venus is your relation to all things. It's just, being relative. Communication is Mercury, so it's the way you communicate yourself. And the Sun is the ego. It's almost as important as the ascendant line, which for Chester Bennington was a Scorpio. So he was a Scorpio ascendant, Pisces, Aries, cusp sun, Sagittarius moon. Pretty intense combination there for those 3. In the house of the home, which is the 4th house, he had these 3 planets, which are also experiences. They're known as experiences in astrology. These experiences are tied to other experiences. In the 5th house is the house of creativity. This is where Chester created Lincoln Park. This is his singing, anything he created that everybody knows him by. This is where it was. And for Chester, that housed Jupiter and the Chiron. The Chiron just makes any planets in this area just more emphasized. So Jupiter is in astrology is known as good luck, fortune, happiness. It's the biggest planet we have in our solar system. Opposite to that, Jupiter, is Saturn. Saturn is like the bad luck. It's the harsh realities, it's the challenges, it's the tests. And it's just that energy, whether you like it or not. That's what Saturn is. And what I find interesting in Chester Bennington's birth chart, in the constellation of Cancer, this is where Chester killed himself right here. It was in this is his 8th house right here. The 8th house is known as change and transformation in the astrological community. Chester had his discipline and his harsh realities and his testing and challenges in the 8th house when he was born. And you got to give someone some props, if they have anything in this house, because these are experiences that change and transform you. And depending on where everything else is in the chart, it can be excruciating and it can be painful. But no matter what, it always brings about the best in you. It always brings the goodness in you, no matter how harsh the experience. Moving over to the 11th house, which is Chester's friends and social groups, it's his bandmates. It's the people he chose to be in a band with. Whereas the 5th house was kind of his singing and what he brought to the band. This was more of the opposite side of how can I apply that to a social group, because it's the other half of it, essentially. It's the other half of that energy. You would look at the 11th house cusp, which is this line, and it goes all the way up to Libra, and Libra is ruled by Venus. So this is important. Remember, Venus ruling the house of his friends. This is the 12th house, which is also known as the house of self-undoing. A lot of people notice murder and suicide to be linked to this house. And in this case, it obviously pertains to Chester Bennington's situation. So you would look at the cusp of the 12th house, the very first line of the 12th house, and that lies in Scorpio. Scorpio is ruled by Pluto. So remember that Venus ruled his friends and Pluto rules his self-undoing. That's very important. Now I want to talk about the day that he killed himself, his horoscope, at 3 a.m. on July 20th. There are reports that it was at 3:03, but I'm just going to say it's 3 o'clock because that's just close enough. So with Venus being his friendship ruler, the house of his social groups, why he was in a band, his relation to Chris Cornell, it's in the constellation of Gemini, which, is known for the overthinking energy. It thinks way too much, but its strong point is Gemini will think about things that you would never even have thought of because they think so much. They just think. And so at that line, almost exactly to the degree, 16 degrees and 17 degrees, almost right there on the ascendant line, housed the moon, which is emotions, and his relations. So this is, again, the most important aspect of the first house of the natal chart. It's the first-hand sight, what you see, what you experience. And this right here, we would see firsthand as the nervous energy that killed him. And this is pretty much the only thing that we could see firsthand without using astrology. Moving on to the house of creativity is Jupiter in the middle, which holds a small aspect to Chester Bennington's midheaven on that day. This is the day he died. Neptune was in its own house of Pisces, so this is where Neptune lives. And I believe that Chester Bennington's largest energy was Piscean energy because he had a lot of Pisces and water in him. And again, with this Chiron, it makes this area of the chart a lot bigger, a lot more emphasized. And this is Chester's midheaven right here. This is his dreams and healing right here. At that moment, to find what he needed to find, lied in this house right here. So, moving on from his midheaven, being Pisces, self-actualizing as a Pisces maybe, or finding that, basically ascending to the stars, Other than that, his friendship and emotion was opposite Saturn and Sagittarius. And that's the harsh realities. So at this time, in this moment, Chester was thinking and living. He was overthinking, feeling, relating to his friends. But ultimately, the stronger aspect was the change and transformation. This is his self-undoing. This is that Pluto, that was the 12th house ruler of self-undoing, which rules suicide and murder. You can see there's a couple lines actually that make it a little bit more bold, the dashed line there. So it was either find his thoughts and ego and move that flow to kill himself, which is ultimately what he did. Or at that moment in his natal chart, Chester could have found where his Pluto, he was looking for happiness is what he was looking for. And in his other chart, happiness was in his creative house, the 5th house. So his band, Linkin Park, that was his happiness, was Linkin Park. He naturally had this affiliation and energy draw from his good luck and happiness, but it ultimately sent him to this instead of this. So where he was starting from, his starting point of that moment when he started feeling depressed and wanting to kill himself, he could do a few things. He could immediately, already he's just feeling his Pisces crying energy of feeling so depressed, and you can see that in the extra bold line that has emphasis on these two indicators here. Or you could, go down here and think about, his creativity, which honestly, this line is a much more easily attainable trait than this one. So with Chester Bennington's Jupiter and happiness being here, he can either go back to his overthinking, or he can go up to this Pluto energy, which is the 8th house, which is change and transformation. And that's what he wanted. Chester Bennington wanted to change and transform. The only thing is, he didn't realize that within himself, within his own Pisces nature, he could have reached his midheaven and just skipped this altogether. But because of where Saturn was, his harsh reality and challenges, it's almost like this pattern of the natal chart is almost a locomotive pattern. It's almost pushing back. It's almost like a grand cross locomotive that pushes back to the ascendant. So it seems like a lot of these patterns and angles are just doorways or paths to different experiences in your life. This Pluto one that Chester Bennington experienced was suicide right here. That Pluto energy right there was suicide. And from his over worrying and emotion and thinking and all that good stuff, or bad stuff, in this case, it easily went down here, because this is an easy aspect. This is a trine degree. So this naturally happens without even trying. He's probably thinking about his joy and happiness, because this is another planetary return, having Jupiter in the 5th house of creativity. So he's just naturally thinking of all these, creative emotions of, being in a band. And this is really his like motivator for not killing himself. But ultimately, he wanted change and transformation. And that planetary ruler of Pluto almost was like the character in the movie that was present at that time to take that payment or something. And so when Chester needed that experience, it was his Plutonian self-destruction energy. And so it's all just really interesting to look at.